The Scots are causing trouble for King Charles II. Rebellion is days away. Who can he trust to ride north and sort it all out? You've guessed it, my hero, James Scott, Duke of Monmouth. The boiled, tarred and quartered limbs of the Popish plot victims had only just been stuck on spikes across London's most prominent landmarks. The furore of the fabricated conspiracy of Tited Oates had inflamed the religious tensions across England and had brought terror and enraged mobs to the streets of London. And already, London and our hero, the Duke of Monmouth, were facing a new enemy, one just as deadly, but not as close as the Popish plot had come. Scotland, King Charles II's most northern kingdom, had been simmering with unrest since the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, and now disquiet and talk of rebellion was beginning to simmer over. But why? After all, hadn't the Scots allied themselves with Charles after his father, King Charles I, had been executed? An execution which had horrified and enraged the Scots. Yes, they had been fighting against the king, but they had not agreed to the removing of his head. During the Interregnum of Cromwell, the future Charles II had travelled across to Scotland and reluctantly agreed to accepting Presbyterianism as the rightful religion of England, if he ever regained that throne. In return, the Scots would provide the military muscle required to invade England and remove the Cromwellian regime. Charles would surely have had his fingers crossed whilst agreeing to this, and he must have hated his coronation ceremony at Scone, where in a freezing cold and draughty chapel, he was forced to sit through a ranting and chafing 3-hour sermon from a Presbyterian minister. Charles was never going to forget these cold, torrid days, and as soon as possible would go back on his word. Like father, like son, you might say. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, it wasn't only the crown that was brought back to Britain. Many religious practices and policies were to be reintroduced, or should we say reimposed. Very soon, he began stamping his authority on his northernmost kingdom and pushing for himself to become the supreme head of the Kirk, the Church of Scotland. Bishops were introduced in Charles's new episcopal policy. This was a lit match flickering near a powder keg. The Scots had formed the Solemn League and Covenant to defy Charles's father, who attempted at forcing bishops and his own religious will on the Scottish people, and that had ended in disaster for King Charles I. But why was Charles so against Presbyterian Scotland, and why was he so adamant to reintroduce bishops? Simply, it was a matter of control. The Episcopalian system with bishops meant the king chose his bishops, who then rolled out the king's religious policy, which then controlled the people through the pulpit. Remember, there were no proper newspapers, no TV news, no social media. People were educated and learnt what was happening in the country through the pulpit. If the king controlled what could be said, then he had control over the people. The Presbyterian system, the way of the covenant, had no room nor time for bishops. The central belief was that every individual, no matter how lowly, could gain salvation through their own prayers and conversations with God. They did not need a priest or a bishop, or indeed the king, to tell them how to converse with the Almighty. It was about the sermon and prayer, less ritual, music, and less ceremony. As you might have guessed, the Scots, like in the 1630s, did not take this imposition lightly. Ministers were forcefully removed from their pulpits if they did not immediately conform to the king's wishes. New episcopal ministers were thrust into their place. Ministers who refused to conform were ordered away from their town or village, and a no-go zone was put in place around Edinburgh. About a third of the 270 ministers refused to renounce the covenant. But despite these early oppressive movements, Covenanters began meeting in fields and in woods to listen to their chosen minister. These rural and illegal meetings, or conventicles, began to grow in popularity incredibly quickly. The Bible is full of tales of oppressed peoples forced into the wild to hear the word of God, and the Covenanters brought that history onto themselves. As more and more people refused to attend church with their new ministers, London and the king had to act. Stricter controls were put in place, names were taken for non-attenders, and the dragoons were called out to break up these illegal conventicles. Some of these were now drawing up to 1,000 people. Dragoons were also recorded as being quartered on Covenanters, who would eat people out of house and home, and then also levy huge fines. Imprisonment, murder, and executions were not far behind. The man who was implementing the king's new and unpopular religious policies in Scotland was himself incredibly unpopular. The Earl of Lauderdale was the man in charge. He ruled with an iron fist, and his justice was often swift and brutal. There were thumbscrews on view in court to frighten the accused into pleading guilty or to perjure themselves. Or, as we can see here, an implement called the boot was used as a method of gaining information. In other words, an instrument of torture. A device where legs were fastened into a metal brace. Wooden pegs were then driven into it to slowly shatter the victim's leg bones. Lauderdale was a man who lived in the shadowy world where spies, secret messages, and plots swirled about him. He would write letters in invisible ink. If he used a Masonic pentacle on his letters, it was a sign he was playing the Mason and that there was a secret message in the letter. His murky world is summed up by many of the letters sent to him, which were finished with the words, "Burn this letter, I entreat you." It wasn't just the average man or woman who experienced Lauderdale's justice. Prominent figures were not excluded. One William Carstairs, the future chaplain of William III, was actually tortured for his beliefs. The spark that lit the fuse, and it often is, was an assassination. Archbishop James Sharp was a despised figure in the Covenanters' eyes. Not only that, they saw him as a traitor. Sharp had been trusted and a loyal figure for the Covenanter cause during the English Civil War. He himself was selected to travel to Breda and to converse with the soon-to-be Charles II, and ensure he would commit to the Presbyterian Kirk when he returned. Well, Charles didn't, and what made things 100 times worse for the Covenanters, the man they had trusted to deputise for them was soon appointed as royal chaplain, and then soon after made Archbishop of St Andrews and Primate of Scotland. The former Covenanter turned his coat to become a despised Archbishop. His days would be numbered. In early May 1679, 9 Covenanters were waiting in ambush, not for Archbishop Sharp, but one Sheriff of Cupper. This was a sheriff who had been appointed by Sharp to persecute Covenanters and impose crippling fines. But unfortunately for the ambushers, the sheriff had heard that they were waiting for him and decided to stay at home. But luck was on the Covenanters' side, for they soon learned that actually and unbelievably their top target was on the road, Sharp himself, and he was coming straight at them. His coach was stopped, Sharp was wrenched from it, and in front of his terrified daughter was stabbed several times before being shot in the chest. One of the assassins, James Russell, spoke to Sharp before he died. He declared before the Lord that it was no particular interest, nor yet for any wrong that he had done to him, but because he had betrayed the church as Judas, and had wrung his hands these 18 or 19 years in the blood of the saints. Following this murder, a large force of government dragoons were ordered to attack and break up a conventicle which was planned in the coming days. As the conventicle began on Sunday the 1st of June, the Reverend Thomas Douglas stopped his sermons with the words, "Ye have got the theory, now for the practice," when he was told that the dragoons were heading his way. Claverhouse, better known to his enemies as Bloody Clavers, had recently been appointed captain with a mission to disperse conventicles in southwest Scotland. He was to make his name and immortality as the Scots leader of the first Jacobite army, which won a battle at Killiecrankie 10 years later, a battle which saw Clavers shot from his horse and killed. But at Drumclog, the Covenanters knew about what was afoot, and with about 200 well-armed men, took up a strong position behind a bog or stank. When the dragoons arrived, they could not engage directly because of the soft ground. Skirmishers exchanged fire across the stank, and Claverhouse believed the battle was swinging in his favour, but he was just unable to close the range and get in for the kill due to the boggy terrain. Now the Covenanters decided to attack. The Covenanters managed to get around the stank and advance rapidly. Despite heavy fire, the attack was entirely successful. Claverhouse's force broke, and the dragoons were soon routed from the battlefield, leaving 36 of their number dead. Back in London, Charles had had enough of his Scottish subjects defying him. He once again entrusted his son to such an important task and ordered him northwards to parley with the rebels and bring them into line. It is important to note, Monmouth did not have the luxury of having a large, organised army to simply gather together and march north. The standing army was now minimal, barely the guards units and a few dispersed independent garrisons. Only recently, Monmouth had been decommissioning large numbers of regiments who had been serving in the Low Countries. So Monmouth not only had to make the tiring march north to Scotland on rutted dirt roads, but he also had to recruit, train, and supply as he marched, a skill that would come in handy 6 years down the road. He ordered the Earl of Oxford's horse to Berwick, at the same time attempting to recruit 3 more cavalry regiments, one to be commanded by a Lord Grey. Remember that name, it will come back to haunt Monmouth in the years to come. And on top of this, one of the cavalry regiments heading for Scotland would be under the command of the Earl of Feversham, another name which would hound him in the not too distant future. But was Monmouth the right man for the job? The king suddenly thought so, for he promoted his son once again, this time Captain General of all His Majesty's forces. Monmouth also had a vested interest in keeping Scotland peaceful, for he had been a large landowner since he was a teenager. He was Lord High Chamberlain, was on the Scottish Privy Council, and was seen by many as Lauderdale's successor. Lauderdale could not see the Scots in so friendly a light as Monmouth could. Lauderdale believed the need for Presbyterianism and the liberty of worship was merely their bid for freedom from central law and government. What was needed was an experienced and inspirational commander for the killing times, as these years were becoming to be called, and they were getting so serious that matters in Scotland were approaching a widespread rebellion. Already there had been government failures. Lord Linlithgow had gathered together 2,500 troops to bring the rebels to battle, but hearing the rebels were numbering 7,000 men, he had to withdraw. Charles initially wanted no recriminations and only prompt amends, but even this moderate policy enraged Lord Russell, who rose to his feet confronting the king. The king, with a quick flick of his wrist, deflected this ire. The Earl of Shaftesbury, the leader of the Whig party and the Green Ribbon Club president, at first was vehemently against English troops invading Scotland, stating it was illegal and unconstitutional. But as soon as Monmouth, the Green Ribbon Club's patron, was selected to command, Shaftesbury soon changed his mind and became an avid supporter of the scheme. So Monmouth's mission was a simple one: march north with all speed, with whatever scant forces he could cobble together, add them to Linlithgow's forces already in Scotland. He was then to take control of Scotland's internal security, seek out, break up the rebels, and restore law and order. Monmouth departed for the north with his father's orders in his pockets, orders that stated he should treat with the rebels and bring peace to the lowlands as quickly as possible. But as soon as Monmouth began riding north, the king sent further orders after his son. They read, "You are not to treat with the rebels, but to fall on them at once." The mission, originally one of reconciliation, had at a stroke of the king's pen become one of fire and sword. When many of the nobles discovered that they and Monmouth had been duped, they resigned their commissions. Men such as Grey, Cavendish, Russell, and Thomas Tyne all stood down, as they now saw the invasion of Scotland as illegal and unconstitutional. But if Monmouth thought this campaign was to be a cakewalk, he was in for a rude shock. The state of the militia forces and independent garrisons in the north were in a desperate condition. Monmouth would need all his skills of organisation, persuasion, and logistics that he had learned in the Netherlands to make this campaign a success. The forces Monmouth found numbered less than 3,000 men, the Anglo-Scottish army being made up of a large number of shire levies. The rebels were nearby, encamped at Hamilton, and on his way north, Monmouth had ordered the government forces to begin closing with them. But due to unseasonable rain and many shortcomings in artillery and ammunition, their departure was delayed. When Monmouth arrived at Blackburn, he found dispirited and uncooperative Scottish commanders. His optimism and drive were desperately needed. On receiving a report on the state of supplies for the army, just like in the Netherlands, he found that they had been cruelly neglected. Monmouth sprung into action and sent a stinging order to the council, written in his own hand. The bread is to come up, but so much short it will not serve us one day, and therefore, with some sharpness, I urge you to send what you promised, and give orders that your stores will be sent to us daily. You may not infinitely prejudge his Majesty's service. 19 cartloads were promptly dispatched. With his army now fed and reinforced by Claverhouse's defeated men and Linlithgow's forces, Monmouth advanced towards his enemy. An enemy who were no mere rabble. They had been drilling and training and had chosen a strong and skillfully chosen position behind the River Clyde. They were well armed as well, for along with the usual scythes, pitchforks and clubs, they had recently ransacked a government armoury and had equipped themselves with many modern muskets. On top of this, they were filled with religious zeal. They were in their clans with their leaders, which all made them a deadly adversary. Monmouth was not intimidated by the apparent size and threat that this Covenanting army posed. He wrote to the council, "I intend to be within a mile of the enemy tomorrow." In charge of the advance guard, Monmouth appointed Major Theophilus Oglethorpe, whose main job was to report back on any movements and push back any bridgeheads that might appear on the Clyde. Just like Feversham and Grey, Oglethorpe would play a role in the Monmouth Rebellion of 1685, although mainly an incompetent one at best. Soon, however, the two opposing armies caught a glimpse of each other. One of the rebel lairds described the moment he saw the government army moving like a procession of monks. A little before day, we saw the enemy kindling their matches a great way off. But Monmouth was concerned about the difference in size of the two armies. His army was about half the size of the Covenanters, and was certainly not a veteran force that he could rely on. He ordered his units to spread themselves out to make a greater show of strength, whilst he spied the barricaded bridge which he and his army had to cross. It was a serious proposition, being supported by timber and boulders. It was closely guarded by 2 companies of infantry and a troop of horse. Linlithgow and Mar, not liking the looks of this impressive obstacle, advised Monmouth to cross at nearby fords. But Monmouth was adamant. He wanted to get his cannon across quickly, directly, and most importantly, dry. He had seen the demoralising effect of well-placed cannon fire on veteran troops in the Low Countries, and he believed that poorly trained troops would not stand against his guns. Monmouth had been informed that the enemy only had 1 cannon, and he promised that it would be silenced soon. One of Claverhouse's officers wrote of Monmouth's positive opinion on the upcoming clash. The Duke was obstinate and would pass no other way than that of the bridge. In the very early hours of the 22nd of June, there was an early dawn skirmish where an important Covenanter commander, Robert Cleland, was killed. One messenger was to meet John Welsh and inform them that the King's army was decamping, and that none knew where they were going except the Duke of Monmouth, if he and the others were to sit down on their knees and beg them to lay down their arms and render themselves in the King's mercy, for he hoped they would get good conditions. If they will not follow this advice, it will ruin the Presbyterian interest. But the Covenanters were not to be browbeaten. The reply was short. If they, the royal army, were willing to have the Duke of Monmouth informed of his father's, his own, and his associates' rebellion against God, and by their blasphemy, persecution, and usurpation of church and state, and to desire him to lay down his weapons that he had taken up against the Lord and his people, to that they would consent, but to no other thing. Monmouth countered, sending a drummer forward as well. He argued that if they did lay down their arms, no reprisals would be taken, and he would guarantee Presbyterian worship in every third church in Scotland. As he spoke, the Scots Regiment of Foot Guards and Royal Regiment of Dragoons began moving forwards. Hamilton, the Covenanter commander, scoffed at Monmouth's entreaties. "And hang next?" he inquired. Words had failed, and in minutes the government guns were brought forward to smash through the Covenanter barricade on the bridge. A savage firefight erupted for the barricade, staunchly defended by the men from East Dunbartonshire, Dumfries, and the Fife Dragoons. The volume of musket balls zipping across the Clyde forced some of the government gunners to run for their lives. An early success saw the Covenanters capture and drag away one of the government cannon. The musketry continued for nearly 3 hours, but the supply problems of the Covenanters was beginning to bite. With ammunition running low, the commander of the advance guard called for reinforcements and powder from the main body. A barrel was swiftly dispatched to the stretched defenders, and when the men opened it, all they found were raisins. On top of logistical nightmares, command and control was beginning to fall apart for the Covenanters. Seeing the differing and indecision in their enemy ranks, the Scots Regiment of Foot Guards, along with the Royal Regiment of Dragoons, forced the crossing and smashed into the bridge defenders. This heroic charge soon became bogged down as they became trapped amongst the houses that littered the area around the bridge. Their rescue, though, was soon at hand, as the government gunners had returned to their charges and poured some closely packed grape shot into the enemy ranks. Monmouth saw the moment and ordered the whole army to advance and pour across the bridge and form on the other side of the River Clyde, a mere 200 yards from the enemy. To stop the Covenanters from interrupting this manoeuvre, the Royal Regiment of Dragoons was to act as a covering force. The Covenanters' command realised that action was needed before the Royal Army formed up properly on their side of the river. Cavalry were ordered forward and smashed into Monmouth's left flank. Despite a successful charge, they were soon surrounded by pike and musket units and were soon pushed back. This cavalry attack, now a panicked mass of wild-eyed horses, then proceeded to ride back through its own infantry. A Covenanter rout was moments away. Hardy's men of Fife attempted to regain the advantage for the Covenanters by loosing a mass volley into the Monmouth centre, but Monmouth was on hand as usual. Opening the men's files, the government artillery arrived at the front line and at point-blank range unleashed a hail of grape shot into the ranks. Blood and carnage ensued. It was too much for the Covenanters. With hills to the rear, heavy fire from the flank, the Covenanters broke. Hamilton ordered his men to flee and protect their colours. He himself wrapped his own colour about him and fled. It was all over, and quicker than anyone could have predicted. But what if the Covenanter command had been more unified? What if the Covenanters had hurled themselves forward when Monmouth's army were vulnerable in marching columns squeezing themselves across the precarious bridge? At the end of the battle, the Scots army had suffered between 400 to 800 casualties, as well as having nearly 1,500 men captured. Monmouth's makeshift force, in contrast, had suffered between 2 and 10 casualties. Monmouth was magnanimous in victory, and instead of hunting down his enemy with bloodthirsty dragoons, he was seen riding about with the Duchess of Hamilton, calling for quarter, preventing his men killing surrendering and wounded men. He was to make his name that day for being a caring commander. It was not, however, certain that Monmouth would have treated the rebels so gently, for when he entered the Covenanter camp, he found a gibbet and freshly tied nooses, presumably for himself and his senior commanders. Yet Monmouth ensued there was a minimum of killing and reprisals after the battle itself. He appeared the perfect military commander, effective in battle, holding a firm grasp of logistics, and able to deliver the decisive stroke. But when the killing was over, he was all for reconciliation and care for his defeated enemy. He sent his own surgeon to treat the enemy wounded, as well as sending word to Sir John Bell, the Provost of Glasgow. He ordered Bell to deliver bread and a hogshead of ale to feed the recently captured prisoners. But despite Monmouth's care and attention to his haul of prisoners, if they were expecting to be freed or treated kindly by the common soldier, they were in for a rude shock. Marched into Greyfriars Churchyard, they were forced onto the ground face down, stripped, tied in pairs, hooded and chained. They were then marched through the streets of Edinburgh, paraded so they had to run the mob's gauntlet. Whilst being harangued and thrashed, taunting calls cried out, "Where is your God now?" But unfortunately for the Covenanter prisoners, their torment was not over by any means. 400 were locked up in a prison cell, measuring, it is reported, at no more than 10 metres by 2, a Scottish version of the Black Hole of Calcutta. Whilst they were held here, many were given the opportunity of release with the Act of Indemnity proclamation, but some, such as ministers and ringleaders, were to be persecuted and banished to the colonies as white slaves. Approximately 260 men were put on board a merchantman called the Crown of London to begin its long voyage to Barbados or Virginia. The London was captained by one Captain Thomas Tedico, who was described by the Reverend Blackadder as a profane, cruel wretch who used them barbarously. The prisoners were all shipped in Leith Roads in an English captain's vessel to be carried to America. He was a profane, cruel wretch and used them barbarously, stowing them up between decks, where they could not get up their heads except to sit or lean, and robbing them of many things their friends sent them for the relief. They never were in such strait and pinch, particularly through scorching drought, as they were allowed little or no drink, and pent up together till many of them fainted and were almost suffocated. On the 10th of December, Tedico put into Deer Sound due to stormy weather, and against local advice, he sailed soon after. The ship was wrecked near Mole Head. As the ship was breaking up, the captain locked down the hatches so the prisoners couldn't get out, and those who did manage to escape were pushed back into the water by the soldiers. Only 50 survived. But what of our hero, James Scott, Duke of Monmouth? It was another stunning victory with minimal loss to the royalist side. It had by any measure been a remarkable campaign. In just over 6 days, he had made the bumpy, uncomfortable journey of 400 miles from London to Edinburgh, sat at Lauderdale's divided council, raised an army, trained and drilled that army, increased the security of Scotland, force-marched his troops across hostile country, solved supply problems, and by the use of combined arms under his control, forced his will onto his opponents and broke them with the loss of less than 10 of his own men. He had proven himself a remarkable military commander once more, but that was not enough. Not anymore. He needed to prove he was the rightful heir to the throne, the position he craved and he believed he had earned 100 times over. He was to return to his father once more, the celebrated hero, the jewel in King Charles II's crown. But already tongues were wagging and plans were being put in place to begin Monmouth's fall from power. After all, was it not clear he had been lenient with the rebels because he saw them as future allies? Men he had spared, men he was sympathetic to, men who shared the same Protestant zeal as himself, men who, when called upon, would rally to his side as the Protestant Duke, the real and legitimate Prince of Wales. Even now, the defeated Covenanters were singing Monmouth's praises, with verses such as, "The hardy peasant, by oppression driven, to battle deemed his cause the cause of heaven, unskilled in arms with useless courage stood, with gentle Monmouth grieved to shed his blood." Allegations and backstabbing would begin before Monmouth had even stepped foot back in London, and it was to see the beginning of the end for our hero. If you missed our last episode on how the Duke and how England survived the blood, deaths, and execution of the Popish plot, click here. As always, thanks for watching.